my name is Catherine. I am a high school OpenSciEd teacher, facilitator, and writer. And in this video, we're going to talk about lesson 10 of the P.1 unit. I really love this lesson because it gives students an opportunity to think about how we ethically can make decisions when creating engineering design solutions. So let's take a look at how we get here to lesson 10. If you recall in lesson 9, where we were focusing on energy storage solutions, we realized that all forms of energy production and storage and extraction, these all have costs as well as benefits that we need to consider. And remember, when we're saying costs, we don't just mean financial or economic costs. We also mean social, environmental, and geopolitical costs as well. So here in lesson 10, we're wondering, how do we actually use all of these trade-offs, and how do we weigh these trade-offs to help us actually determine what is best for a design solution for our community? So before we dive into lesson 10 further, let's take a look at our lesson at a glance. This lesson is 3 days of instruction overall. It is an investigation routine lesson, but we do not have any hands-on wet labs here in this lesson. Students do need devices, as there is an electronic exit ticket on day 3. And there is no additional material preparation for you other than the typical reading through the teacher guide and making copies. So throughout this 3-day lesson, there are 3 key sense-making opportunities for students as we consider how do we actually weigh all of the trade-offs and make ethical decisions. So this first key sense-making opportunity comes in day 1 of lesson 10 here, where students are reading articles to help them identify trade-offs in all of the energy sources that we've been looking at since lesson number 4. As in lesson 9, we were really just looking at the storage solutions. And so by thinking about all of these trade-offs, we realize that we need a way to actually keep track of them and rate them all in one place. So we decide to create a class consensus matrix and combine our ideas from our individual matrices that we created and have been using throughout the unit. So moving into day 2, we have this second sense-making opportunity that is key for students, where they're realizing that we aren't the only people who are interested in or affected by this particular design solution. So we need a way to gather information from other people who aren't in the room to help us better weigh these trade-offs on our matrix. So we develop a script for how we can actually interview members of our community and bring that information back the next day. So in the last day of this lesson, lesson 10, day 3, we bring in our information collected from our community interviews. And our next key sense-making opportunity here is deciding how we're going to actually use the feedback from members of the community and weigh our criteria on our decision matrix, as we're trying to determine the values that we should use as we assess our trade-offs and create our design challenge project, which will start here on day 3 of lesson 10. We'll get an intro to it, and then that will carry over into lesson 11. So throughout this lesson, lesson 10, students figure out that when we're designing solutions to problems, we need to take into account a range of constraints. Again, constraints aren't just financial and cost, although that is important, but we also need to think about safety, reliability in this case, as well as perhaps aesthetics. I don't maybe want to live next to an ugly power plant. That might be something that comes up in a community interview. And when we develop a solution, we also have to consider the impacts of our choices and some unintended consequences of what we may be choosing to do. And we need to think about those in terms of the social, cultural, as well as environmental areas. And then lastly, we realize that input from interested parties is a really helpful tool for helping us decide how we're going to address these trade-offs. So let's take a look at these key moments a little bit further. This first one is in day 1, where students, again, are reading and identifying trade-offs. Students have one of these different energy sources that they read about, and they identify at least one benefit and one cost about their assigned energy source. And they articulate that into a trade-off statement that would sound something like, when choosing whether or not to use this source, we need to consider a trade-off between blank benefit and blank cost. So from here, we develop our class consensus matrix. Again, this will mirror the ones that we have as individuals from lesson 4. And so as a class, we decide what are the criteria that we want to consider across the top. We'll add in our sources. We'll decide on our rating system. Maybe it's the same from lesson 4. Maybe we decide on a different one. And by doing this, we realize that no one source has a high rating for every criteria. So how do we decide which things are important, which criteria are important? Because there's no one clear source winner. So this gets us to consider values of interested parties. And just to note here, we are using in this unit the term interested parties instead of stakeholder, as that term stakeholder has some historical associations with power and oppression. And if you want to know more about that, check out the teacher edition. There is a call out box. So we start off reading quotes from interested parties, and then we discuss how these quotes from these fictitious people represent their values and how their values are similar to or different from our individual and class values. Well, we realize that we're not designing a solution here for just like quoted, random, made up people, but we're actually thinking about a real community. So if we're thinking about a real community, we need feedback from real people in our community. So students in part 9 here in day 2, we develop a script so that we can complete some interviews as home learning. And it's really important that we do not skip this step. So if home learning is not reasonable for you in your context, then we need to make some time in class for students to go out and find others in the school community to interview. After that interview, we bring back that material, and in part 12 here, which is in day 3, we decide how we want to weigh our criteria on our consensus matrix. And we use some stickers to help identify patterns in the importance of each criterion based on our interviews. And then from here, we have information needed to begin our design challenge. And together or with our group, we complete the first question to help us prepare a community plan. And this first question is asking us information about how we're going to identify our priority criterion from our interested party interviews. And so students will continue the rest of this in lesson 11 as one of their key sense-making and assessment opportunities in that lesson. So where do we go from here? Well, in lesson 10 here, we identified the trade-offs of these various energy sources, and we identified criteria that we should use to weigh these criteria in area or in order, of importance based off of our interested parties. And then this is wondering how we can now develop a solution for our community. And so that'll be the focus of the next lesson. So let's talk briefly here about some material management tips and tricks. First one that I want you to be aware of is in that jigsaw in part 2 that the teacher edition does have a call out box about reading levels. It identifies a couple of sources that have a higher or lower lexile level that can help you decide which individuals get those readings. And then to really emphasize with your students to use the share out sentence frame that's on their reading and on their slide to articulate their cost and their benefit in one coherent statement. And then the other tip and trick I have for you is about the consensus decision matrix that shows up in day 1 and again in day 3 of this lesson in parts 4 and 12. And that is, it's really up to you and your class to decide what makes sense. And it's okay if period 1 and period 2 have different ideas. But you want to identify your criteria, things like highly reliable, highly renewable, low environmental impact, Decide together on what your rating system should be. Do I want to use stars? Do I want 3? Do I want 4? Do I want to use check marks? Again, it doesn't matter, whatever makes sense to that group of students. And then when we weigh the criteria, the teacher's guide does have some suggestions. You could multiply rankings, for example, if everything that had the highest priority, number 1, maybe that one's you're multiplying by 2, and the second one you're multiplying by 1, or you're just giving additional stars to the ones that you find important, or just highlighting them on the matrix. Again, you just want to find a way to make these stand out. There are a couple of terms that come up in this lesson to be aware of for your personal glossary. Costs and benefits are going to be terms that you co-construct together and add to your glossary. These are going to show up primarily in day 1 in those jigsaw readings. And then in the actual interview protocol, there are words like interested party, life cycle analysis, dispatchability. Those can also come up in some of your interested party interviews as well as in the readings. Those are things that you just encounter, but we're not really co-constructing meaning. And then lastly, for resource or poster management, we are going to need to pull out those individual lesson 4 matrices so that we can make one class matrix. And you will need to hold on to this matrix as you will use it again in lesson 11. So thank you for joining me to hear more about lesson 10. I hope you find this lesson enjoyable like I do as we think about the ethics of how we make decisions in engineering. And I hope you join us in the next video as we think about how we take those priorities and actually design a solution that best meets our community's energy needs in lesson 11. Thanks for joining.